All right, buckle up for a deep dive into a world where, well, your local leader might be a former peasant who funds schools and hospitals, but also orders brutal massacres. We're talking Colombian paramilitary groups, and
Right.
oh, it's way more complicated than it sounds.
You're absolutely right. We often see conflict in black and white, but
Mm.
the reality in Colombia, with its long history, is it's much more nuanced.
For sure. And that's what we're exploring today. We've got this research paper, Fear and Dreams, Understanding the Non-Institutional Sources of Leader Strategy. These researchers really dug deep into the strategies of Colombian paramilitary groups, especially those in the AUC, which is kind of an umbrella organization for smaller independent units. They called them fronts.
And those fronts are where things get interesting.
Mm.
Even though they were part of the AUC, they had lots of freedom in how they operated. Some, they were all about violence and intimidation, while others focused on providing public goods, like schools and hospitals. And then you had those who did both.
It's crazy to think about, right? Almost like they were running mini states within the state. But before we get too into that, can you give us some historical context on how these groups even emerged?
Absolutely. Picture Colombia in the 1960s. You've got these Marxist guerrilla groups like the FARC and ELN gaining ground in rural areas. This created a lot of fear and instability. And in response, these paramilitary groups started popping up, often funded by landowners and businesses, who saw them as a way to protect their interests from the guerrillas.
So it started as like a self-defense movement.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But it escalated quickly, especially after the AUC formed in 1997. It brought together many smaller paramilitary groups, leading to this huge expansion of their power and influence. They ended up controlling a vast area of the country, nearly three-quarters of Colombian municipalities.
Wow, that's massive. But you mentioned not all these fronts acted the same way. Some were all about violence, carrying out targeted killings and even massacres, which, as the study points out, are defined as the killing of four or more unarmed people in the same place at the same time. It's a chilling reminder of how brutal this conflict was.
It was, and here's the thing. All of the fronts used violence to some degree, but only some of them also focused on providing public goods. And that's the main question this study tries to answer. What led to these different approaches?
That's where the fear and dreams idea comes in, right? Some groups ruled through fear and violence, while others tried to win over the population by offering these dreams of a better life through things like schools and hospitals.
Exactly. But what the researchers found is that it wasn't as simple as choosing one strategy over the other. Many groups employed both, using violence as a kind of stick and public goods as the carrot.
So it wasn't about being good or evil, but rather about using whatever tools were available to gain and maintain control.
That seems to be the case. And what's really fascinating is they found a specific type of leader who was more likely to use this dual approach. Commanders with peasant backgrounds.
Wait, peasant commanders? That sounds almost counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But these commanders, who the study defines as those born in mostly rural areas, they were very familiar with the needs and cultural norms of their communities. They understood the power of what social scientists call reciprocal preferences.
Reciprocal preferences. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. It's basically the idea of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's about mutual aid and obligation, deeply rooted in rural peasant culture. These commanders brought that same mindset to their leadership.
So they were providing public goods, not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they expected something in return, like loyalty, obedience, maybe even information.
Exactly. They were creating a system of mutual dependence, using both positive and negative reinforcement to ensure their authority.
And that explains why the study found a strong correlation between public good provision and massacres within the same front. It's a chilling reminder that these weren't benevolent actors. They were strategic and ruthless, using both violence and kindness as tools of control.
That's exactly right. It's a complex and unsettling truth that challenges our simple notions of good and bad guys.
Speaking of complexity, the study mentions a commander nicknamed MacGyver. Can you tell us more about him?
He's a perfect example of this paradox. He was a peasant commander who operated in the Ladonta region. He built infrastructure, held public trials, even created a kind of constitution for his front. But he also used violence systematically to maintain his power.
There's a quote from someone in Ladonta who said that MacGyver was different because he built and destroyed. It really captures that double-edged nature of his leadership.
And that's what makes this research so fascinating. It forces us to look beyond simple explanations and grapple with the messy realities of conflict. These weren't just thugs running wild. They were often highly organized and strategic, playing a long game of power and control.
So these fronts were more than just groups of fighters. They were almost like mini governments with their own rules and systems of enforcement. It's incredible.
And to strengthen their findings, the researchers look at how these front boundaries were determined. Turns out, they were often based on things like geographic features or agreements between commanders, rather than pre-existing social or economic conditions.
So it was almost like dividing up a playground. Like you get that side of the river, we get this side of the mountain.
Exactly. And that's important because it suggests that the differences in their strategies weren't driven by the territories themselves, but rather by the individual commanders and their backgrounds. It reinforces the idea that these peasant commanders, with their understanding of reciprocal preferences, were playing a different game altogether.
It's like they were bringing their own cultural playbook to the battlefield. But if that's the case, how were these commanders even chosen? Did the AUC deliberately place them in certain areas based on their skills or backgrounds?
That's a great question, Anna. The research suggests the answer is no. Commander appointments often relied more on personal connections, like family ties, friendships, or specific skills, than on strategic placement.
So it was more about who you knew than what you knew.
It seems that way, and that makes the findings about peasant commanders even more intriguing. If their background wasn't a deliberate factor in their placement, it strengthens the argument that their tendency towards both providing public goods and using violence was deeply rooted in their personal values and experiences.
So these peasant commanders weren't chosen for their unique approach. They brought it with them almost instinctively. This is getting really fascinating. We've uncovered so much about the structure and strategies of these fronts, but we've only scratched the surface. There's still so much to learn about how these fear and dreams tactics were actually implemented on the ground.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll examine the specific ways these strategies played out in communities and the impact they had on everyday life. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Colombian paramilitarism. Last time, we were talking about the two main strategies these groups used. Providing public goods and using violence. It really makes you wonder how those two things could even go together.
Yeah, it's almost like a contradiction, right? You're building schools and hospitals in one village and then orchestrating a massacre in the next. How do you make sense of that?
It's definitely a puzzle, and that's exactly what this research tries to unpack. One of the most striking findings is that those two strategies, public goods and violence, they weren't separate choices. They were often deeply intertwined.
So it's not a simple either. It's not just fear or dreams. These groups were using both at the same time, almost like a 1-2 punch.
Exactly. Remember that quote we heard earlier about the peasant commander MacGyver who built and destroyed? That perfectly sums up this dynamic. These groups weren't just about mindless brutality. They were incredibly strategic in how they used both violence and seemingly benevolent actions to get what they wanted.
It's almost like they were trying to create this twisted sense of obligation, like, we'll take care of you, but step out of line and there will be consequences. Was that a deliberate tactic?
It's fascinating, isn't it? The researchers actually use the term complementarity to describe this link between public goods and violence. They found a strong correlation between the two within the same front, meaning those groups providing public goods were also more likely to carry out massacres.
Okay, so we've got this correlation, but what does it tell us about their motivations? Were they trying to be like Robin Hood figures? Or was it all just about power?
Well, it definitely challenges that simple fear or dreams idea. It suggests that these groups weren't driven by just one or the other. Instead, they were using both strategies as tools to achieve their ultimate goal, control. They were playing a long game, and they needed both the carrot and the stick to be effective.
It's a disturbing thought that someone could be building a school one day and ordering a massacre the next, all in the name of power. But this brings us back to those peasant commanders, doesn't it? They were the ones most likely to employ this combined strategy.
Absolutely. And the study suggests that their upbringing, their deep understanding of reciprocal preferences, played a crucial role in this approach. Remember, these commanders came from rural communities where mutual aid and obligation were the norm. They were used to operating within a system where you help your neighbors, and they help you in return.
So they were taking this traditional concept of community and applying it to a situation of armed conflict, providing for your people, but also demanding their absolute loyalty and obedience in return. It's a fascinating, albeit terrifying, example of how cultural norms can shape conflict.
Exactly. It's as if they were imposing a traditional social contract
Hmm.
on a very untraditional situation. And you're right, it is terrifying. The threat of violence was always there, lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly benevolent exchange.
The study actually gives an example of a commander called Bordelon, who operated in the Puerto Boyacá region. They described him as having humble and peasant origins. And his front was known for both providing public goods and being incredibly violent.
Baudelain's story really embodies this complicated dynamic. His background, the cultural values he grew up with, and the brutal realities of the conflict, they all came together to shape his leadership. He might have genuinely believed he was doing right by his community, but he also ruled with an iron fist.
It's a stark reminder that even good intentions can get twisted in the context of war. But speaking of twisted, the study mentions that these fronts weren't just about public goods and massacres. They also engaged in other forms of control, like resolving disputes, levying taxes, even writing their own constitutions, which they called estatutes.
That's right. It's almost as if they were setting up parallel governments within the Colombian state, with their own laws, courts, and ways of enforcing them. They were remarkably organized and ambitious, weren't they?
It's mind-boggling to think about the level of control they were able to achieve. They weren't just fighting a war, they were building a whole new system of power. And that's what makes this research so important. It forces us to grapple with the complexity of these groups. They weren't just simple villains, they were products of their environment, driven by a mix of ideology, self-preservation, and a hunger for power.
Absolutely. They understood how to exploit the existing social and economic conditions to their advantage, using a blend of force, persuasion, and even a twisted sense of community building.
Right.
To achieve their goals,
And it's so important for us, as informed citizens, to understand those complexities. We can't afford to oversimplify these conflicts or demonize entire groups without understanding the factors that drive their behavior. We need to look beyond the surface and see the human stories, the motivations, and the consequences that shape these situations.
I couldn't agree more. Nuance is crucial, especially when we're talking about issues of war and peace. Only by understanding this intricate web of motivations, strategies, and consequences can we hope to find lasting solutions to these complex challenges. But all this talk of strategy and control makes me wonder, did it actually work? Did this approach of blending fear and dreams ultimately lead to lasting power and influence for these paramilitary groups?
That's the big question, isn't it? Did they achieve what they set out to do? And I guess that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. What happened in the long run? Did their strategies ultimately succeed? Or did they backfire in some way?
That's a great point, and that's exactly what we'll be tackling next. Stay tuned to find out.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Colombian paramilitary strategies.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
Yeah, we've been talking about this fascinating and honestly disturbing blend of fear and dreams, providing for communities while also using brutal violence. But the big question is, did it actually work? Did this approach actually lead to lasting power and influence for these groups?
That's the key question, right? Were these strategies effective in the long run? To answer that, we need to look at both the research findings and the historical context.
Okay, so let's start with the research. Did the study find any connection between these strategies and how long these groups were able to hold on to power?
They did. The study looked at how long each front was able to maintain control of their territory, essentially measuring their lifespan. And what they found is pretty interesting. Fronts led by those peasant commanders, the ones who provided public goods alongside the use of violence, they actually tended to last longer.
So it wasn't just about winning hearts and minds for a short period. These peasant commanders were playing a longer game, building a system that was designed to endure.
Exactly. Their understanding of reciprocal preferences wasn't just about short-term gains. It was about weaving themselves into the fabric of the community, establishing a system of mutual dependence that could withstand challenges.
That's a pretty profound insight. It suggests that this seemingly contradictory approach, using both carrots and sticks, might have actually been a more effective way to create lasting control.
Right. It makes you think about the nature of power, doesn't it? Sometimes, offering a helping hand can be just as powerful as wielding a weapon, especially when those actions are strategically intertwined.
But hold on a second. Just because these groups lasted longer, does that mean they were actually successful in the bigger picture? What about the impact they had on Colombian society as a whole?
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
And it's where things get even more complicated. We have to remember that paramilitary groups were often deeply connected to the Colombian state, to politicians, and to powerful economic interests.
Yeah, that whole parapolitics scandal really exposed those links.
It did. And while this particular study didn't directly examine those political dimensions, it's impossible to ignore the broader influence these groups had on Colombian society, both positive and negative.
So even if some fronts might have achieved a degree of stability within their territories, they were also contributing to a larger culture of violence and impunity that plagued Colombia for decades.
Unfortunately, yes. And that's the real tragedy of this story. Even when these commanders were motivated by those reciprocal preferences, by those deeply ingrained values of community and obligation, they were ultimately caught up in a cycle of conflict that inflicted immense suffering.
It's a tough pill to swallow. It makes you think about the compromises people make when they're living under the constant threat of violence, if you're in that situation. A leader who provides some security and basic services might seem like a good deal, even if you know they have blood on their hands.
That's such a powerful point. And it's a question this research really forces us to confront. There are no easy answers in these situations, and it challenges us to grapple with ethical dilemmas inherent in conflict.
It also reminds us that leadership, power, and violence are rarely straightforward. They're often tangled together in ways that defy easy categorization.
Absolutely. This study gives us a fascinating glimpse into one specific context, but it also raises a whole host of new questions
Yeah.
that deserve further exploration.
For example, we've been focusing on Colombia. But these dynamics of fear and dreams, this blending of seemingly opposite approaches, is probably happening in conflict zones all over the world.
You're absolutely right. It's a universal story, in a way, about how humans try to establish order and control in chaotic situations, often using whatever tools are at their disposal.
And as informed citizens, it's our responsibility to understand these tactics, to recognize the patterns, and to hold those in power accountable, regardless of their motivations or justifications.
That's the key takeaway here. Knowledge is power. And the more we understand about the complexities of conflict, the better equipped we are to work towards a more peaceful and just world.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Colombian paramilitary strategies, what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with today?
I think the most important message is this. We can't afford to oversimplify conflict. We need to move beyond those black and white narratives
Mm.
and be willing to see the nuances, the contradictions, and the unintended consequences that shape these situations.
It's about asking those tough questions, challenging our assumptions, and embracing the shades of gray that color the human experience.
Exactly. Because only then can we begin to truly understand the roots of conflict and work towards solutions that are both effective and just.
Well, it's been an incredible journey, and I really appreciate you guiding us through this complex and thought-provoking topic.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listener out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter most. Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive, where we unpack the complexities of the world, one fascinating topic at a time.